Hey guys, welcome back to my channel. This is the third installment in a three-part series that I've been doing on colored pencil basics and using colored pencils, specifically wax-based colored pencils, wax or oil-based colored pencils, and some of the things that I have learned that have been helpful for me. I've already covered mark making and laying them down on the papers, like how heavy or how light. I've covered values in color and also blending. So those are in the two previous videos, which I will link in the description box. So check those out if you haven't seen them already. And today is going to be kind of the catch-all. So I'm going to cover a bunch of different things like papers and sharpening, using colored pencils with other media, and troubleshooting, what to do when you have certain challenges in a piece, what to do if something goes wrong, and finally finishing. So I hope I can get through all of that in a reasonable time. So I am just going to jump right in because it is a ton of stuff to go over. So first off, for papers, there are papers that are specifically made for colored pencils, and I have never used them. I know some people do use them and they work great. I tend to use other kinds of paper since I don't really do straight up just pure colored pencil stuff. Almost all of my stuff is mixed media, and I tend to use wet and dry media. So I need papers that can handle all of that. But basically there is no one right paper for colored pencils. So if you can use the official colored pencil paper, but you can really use any paper that you want to put the colored pencil on. Putting the colored pencil on it makes it a colored pencil paper. Really, you can use any kind of paper. The thing to be aware of is that different kinds of papers, there is something going on in the city. So the important thing to be aware of is that different papers have different properties, from depending on how heavy the paper is, like how heavy and thick, to how it was made, what it's made out of. All of those things go into influencing the characteristics of that paper, and therefore the way it's going to interact with whatever media you put on it, including colored pencil. So I'm not a paper expert. I've tried some different papers, but I don't just like purposely buy things just to try papers just to try them. I really only get papers if I think it's something that is going to work for me, and every once in a while I'll experiment. But I would say the most important things to be aware of if you are wanting your art to last and you are going to sell your art, you should definitely be buying acid-free paper. So that would be the number one thing to look for in a paper, is having it be acid-free and archival. And aside from that, you want to consider some characteristics of the paper. So like I mentioned, how weighty it is. And the weight, if a paper is heavier weight, it's going to be more expensive, definitely. But I tend to buy heavier weight papers because, again, I mentioned that I do mixed media. And for wet media, you're really supposed to stretch your paper. And I hate stretching my paper. I like to just get going and, I don't know, skip those prep steps. Plus, if you stretch your paper, you have to have it on board, and boards take up space. And anyway, I don't do that, and heavier weight paper doesn't tend to buckle as much. So that is one reason why I really prefer it. And it also usually is sturdier, although there are other things that can go into making a paper sturdy or not, but typically a heavyweight paper will be sturdier. So it can take a lot of layers, which I tend to do. So yeah, if you go for a lighter weight paper, it will definitely be less expensive, and it may be a really nice paper still. But I would say if you're somebody who's doing fewer layers, then maybe you could go for a lighter weight paper. But if you're going to put your paper through a lot, you should go for a heavier weight paper. Now there's also the surface texture of the paper. So how smooth or how rough a paper is. And if you're using watercolor paper, or mixed media paper, or printmaking paper, any of those is going to have their own characteristics. But just taking watercolor paper for example, which I use quite a bit of watercolor paper because I use watercolor usually on my first layers. Watercolor paper can go all the way from hot press, which is super, super smooth, to cold press, which is like a little bit of texture, has some texture, although there's no like official definition for what that is. So a cold press from one brand might be almost totally smooth, whereas a cold press from another brand could be really rough. And then the third and the other end of the spectrum is rough. So it goes from hot press, cold press, to rough, and some brands have like ultra rough or very rough or whatever, which is like really textured. So the good way to think about it, and if you've been watching for a while, you've heard me use this term a lot, and it's not my term, but it's just a general term in the art world, is toothiness. So how much tooth the paper has. So a super smooth paper isn't really going to have much teeth at all. A cold press paper will have a little bit of tooth to it, so a little bit of grip. A rough paper will have a lot of tooth to it. And if you imagine that, like you're kind of rubbing the pigment back and forth on it, on a hot press paper, there's not a lot of place for it to go. So hot press is great if you're using just straight up watercolor, because it's going to soak into the paper and you don't really need those teeth to hold on to it. But if you're doing any kind of dry media, whether it's pastel or colored pencils, you really need at least some tooth to grab onto it. So I have tried hot press, and there's some like really beautiful hot press papers out there. But for me, I tend to go for something that is like either cold press or a printmaking paper, like the BFK Reeves, which I use a lot, and it has a tiny bit of a tooth to it, but it's like very absorbent. And then my other favorite right now is the Fabriano Artistico, the ultra heavyweight. I think it's like 400 GSM, so it's really thick. I will put both of those in the description box, but those are basically my two favorite papers at the moment. The BFK Reeves is what I would use if I want the more smooth surface. So I tend to choose based on the subject. So if I'm painting something that is really smooth, like a person, or well, like skin is smooth relatively, or man-made object like a glass or a shoe or something like that, or something that has like a ton of little tiny detail, I'm gonna go for something that has less tooth. So like I would use the BFK Reeves. And if I'm doing something that's more textured, like a bird with all those awesome feathers, or certain kinds of food, I would tend to opt for something that has more tooth to it. And the other complicating factor there is size. So if I'm doing something really big, I probably would use a paper that has more tooth regardless, just because I actually prefer working on that. I think it's a more fun experience. But if I'm working on a smaller scale, those teeth, if you kind of think of it like in comparison to the size of your subject, like if you're trying to do a little tiny bird and it has these, like the paper has this big texture to it, you're going to be trying to put in those little details, and it's almost going to have like a wobbliness to it. I don't know, I hope that makes sense, but I would say if I'm doing something that's really detailed and on a smaller scale, definitely the smoother paper. If I'm doing something that's rougher, I would do the rougher paper, or if I'm doing something that's really big, then I would do the rougher paper regardless, just because it's more fun. So that is what I would say about paper. And next point is sharpening. So sharpening colored pencils. You wouldn't think that this would be such a big thing, but like it is a huge deal if you use a lot of colored pencil like I do, and if you spend as many hours of your week as I do working with colored pencils, a lot of that time is also sharpening. And I've used everything from like the standard, I can't think of the brand of it, but like that one that has the fake wood on the outside, like that electric pencil sharpener. I've used that. I've used, what is this one? This is the Hoo electric pencil sharpener. It's battery powered and portable. And I really liked that at one point, and then it died. And I bought replacement blades and everything. It still died. I've used this classic Prismacolor sharpener, which a lot of people seem to like. I kind of hate it because if you're like really going to town and sharpening your pencils, like this is kind of a joke. This is never going to hold much in the way of pencil shavings, and it also it didn't keep the Prismacolors from breaking. Now a note on that: Prismacolors are going to break no matter what you do, because the lead a lot of the time is off center. But there are sharpeners that I have found that work better, and I've mentioned them before. And the one that has been the best for me is the Alvin Brass Bullet. Is that going to focus? Yeah, there it goes, the Alvin brass bullet. And the reason I like this one the most is because it has a blade, just the single blade that you can change really easy. So you can keep it super sharp, and that's key for keeping your Prismacolors from breaking. And it also makes it so that you can twist the sharpener easier, which is what you're supposed to do. You're supposed to hold the pencil steady and twist the sharpener. So both of those aspects make this thing work really well. And I have also been using this Prismacolor sharpener recently because I've been using Karanda Ash Luminance pencils as well as my Prismacolors. And the Karanda Ash do not really fit very well in the brass bullet. They fit much better, ironically, in the Prismacolor one. So these are just the pencil sharpeners that I have kept around. I've tried a bunch of others. And I'm kind of always on the lookout for a good sharpener. But I would say, yeah, if you're using colored pencils, the most important thing is that you have a nice sharp blade. So if you're using a sharpener like this where you can't easily change the blade, you should be replacing the sharpener fairly frequently. And something like this where you can change the blade, you should change the blade periodically whenever it gets dull. In terms of like success with avoiding breakage, probably the best thing is having an electric sharpener. And I actually need to get one. I had the one that I mentioned earlier for a while, and then I had this battery powered one. And I think the best combination that works well for me is using the brass bullet as much as I can, because the brass bullet doesn't take off much, it doesn't waste as much of the pencil. But if you're having one of those days where you're like sharpening and sharpening and sharpening and sharpening and it keeps breaking, then an electric sharpener can be good for that. So having one that you can kind of go back and forth between, like especially having that electric sharpener is great if you have a really troublesome pencil with like a very off-kilter lead. And other people have mentioned, actually whenever you guys mention a sharpener, I do look them up, and I can't remember the brand name, but somebody had mentioned one a while ago that sounded amazing based on their description, but the size didn't work. So I don't know, if you have other recommendations, that is something I would be interested in trying, so feel free to leave those in the comments, and hopefully other people could see those too and benefit from that as well. So that is what I have to say about sharpening colored pencils. The next point is using colored pencils with other media. And again, I've done a whole video on this before, so I will try to put that in the description box. Basically, there aren't any rules when it comes to mixed media. I mean, if you can get it to work, then great. But what I have found personally is that if you're going to use colored pencils combined with watercolor, because colored pencil is wax based, once you put the colored pencil down on the paper, especially if it's a heavier application, if you lay watercolor down on top of that, the watercolor will not be able to get into the page because the wax kind of forms like a seal over the paper. So if you're going to use watercolor, you want to use, in most cases, you want to use watercolor first and then do the colored pencil on top of that. And if you want to use colored pencil with acrylic, I find it's best to do the colored pencil and then the acrylic on top of the colored pencil, because if you do the acrylic first, it's going to seal off the tooth of the paper, so you're not going to be able to get any colored pencil down into the paper. And I would say the same thing if you're going to use them with oil, although I really have never used oil with paper. I know people do, but there's all kinds of other, I think, considerations that you would have there in terms of keeping it archival. So yeah, I would just say I would imagine that oil is the same, that you should do oil after the colored pencil, but I don't know that from experience. So if anybody else does, again, put that in the comments so other people can see it. And if you're going to use them with marker or ink, I would say the same thing about watercolor. Same thing I did about watercolor. You should do the marker or ink first. And a cool thing with doing that, with either doing watercolor or ink before you do colored pencil, is that if you want to have an area that's like really, really dark, like I'm just working on a commission right now that has a bird with like a jet black beak, and so I did all of that in ink because then I can add the shine on top of it with different lighter colored pencils, and that works really well. Whereas if I did the whole beak in black colored pencil and then tried to put the shine on top, I wouldn't be able to get as opaque of a highlight as I can with the white colored pencil over the black ink. So yeah, that's a little overview of using them with other media. And if you want to see more about that, more about blending and using different media together, I will put that link in the description box to that other video that I mentioned. All right, we are coming up to the end here. So second to last point, I wanted to cover a few points of troubleshooting. Now I mentioned this in the second video in the series when I was talking about what to do if you have laid down too much dark pigment or even too much light pigment, either end of the spectrum. And that's a situation you probably will find yourself in at some point if you are working with colored pencils, where you have basically filled up the tooth of the paper and you've put so much down that you really can't get anything else on top and it's just kind of gliding over the top. Now, if you are relatively happy with the color that you have underneath, what you can do is use a fixative, a workable spray fixative. So you can take it outside, always use any sprays, use them outside. And apply the fixative to your paper. Always want to be sure to test it first. And once you've done that and you can apply you're sure that you can apply the fixative, do so, wait for it to dry, and then that'll give a little bit more tooth to the surface of the paper so that your pigment, your new layers of colored pencil have something to grab onto. And if you have put down too much dark pigment and you're actually wanting to like really dial it back and have an area be much lighter, this is a trick that I do and it works, but in a limited way, and you really should only do it in small areas of your piece. And it's basically to use gouache. So I would use an acrylic gouache. There's two different kinds. There's either designer's gouache or artist's gouache. And some gouache are re-wettable. So if you add more water after it's dried, it will reactivate the same way that watercolor does. That's not the kind you want to use. You want to use the acrylic based gouache. So the kind that once it's dry, it's totally dry. And the reason you do gouache over acrylic is that gouache has like a really matte surface. So what I would do is I would just take the gouache and do a really kind of stiff dry brush like this, and I would scumble it. So like kind of move the dry brush just like with a tiny bit of gouache around all over the surface that I'm trying to cover up. So for example, like once I had a commission where I was doing a portrait of and the client's mother, the picture that they gave me to work from, she had a stroke, so her eye had some droop to it, and I was just following the reference photo, and I should have asked the client specifically whether they wanted that eye captured the way it really was, and I didn't. And then when they saw the finished piece, like they really didn't like that aspect of it because it reminded them of how their mom was sick. So that was a relatively small surface area, but I had totally filled that up with pigment, and I kind of needed to rework the structure of the eye. So I just scumbled over it with white gouache, and then was able to, using a combination of gouache and colored pencil, was able to recreate that eye. So that's a little trick that you can do if you have either put down too much pigment or the wrong color, or had some other issue like I did with the eye in that painting. I can't actually think of any other specific points to troubleshoot with colored pencils, but if you all have questions, put them in the description box and maybe I can do a whole other video on it. Yeah, maybe I shouldn't even have this point in this video, but anyway, it's here now. So the last point is finishing. So the way I like to finish colored pencil pieces is with some kind of a spray varnish, and there are versions that are matte, so it's not going to look shiny at all. It's not going to ruin the aesthetic of the paper. And there are versions that have UV protection, and I will link both of those in the description box. But yeah, I actually have had really good luck with spray varnishes. People complain about them a lot, about either varnishes or about both varnishes and fixatives, because there can be challenges with them changing the look of the finished piece. And I will say I have absolutely had that challenge with soft pastel. I don't really do much soft pastel anymore, but I used to do quite a bit of it. And using spray fixatives and spray varnishes with those can definitely change the color. But for me, with colored pencil and mixed media, I haven't had that. battery ran out. Anyway, I haven't had that issue as long as I have been really meticulous with following the manufacturer's instructions. So they say to test, make sure you always test it. And usually a spray varnish will say not to use on days with high humidity. And if you use it on days with high humidity, you may have problems. So I always use it on days with low humidity. So always be sure to test, and always be sure to use with the manufacturer's instructions, really, really taking those seriously and following them. So when I've done those things, I've had no trouble, but I do know that there are people that have really strong feelings about using spray varnishes and how they ruin their pieces and all of that. So that is the method that I use, and it works well for me, but just take that with a grain of salt. Yeah, I don't want anybody ruining their pieces on my account. Okay, so I think that is it, and that wraps up my 3-part overview of everything colored pencil. I hope it was really helpful for you all. Yeah, as I mentioned, if you have other questions about troubleshooting or issues that have come up with colored pencils, leave them in the comments and I'll see if there is enough for me to do another video. And again, just like I mentioned in the last video, I do have a really robust frequently asked questions page. So especially if you're new and you haven't seen many of my other videos, please do check there if you're asking a question and I haven't answered it. Yes, that is it, and I hope everybody has a great week, and I will see you all in the next video. Bye!